Hey guys. Tonight we drift back toward the first horizon humanity ever truly shaped. A place where water once moved like a living script across the earth, where cities rose from silt and disappeared into it again. These are the vanished shores of Mesopotamia, what time forgot, and what we now quietly rediscover in the silence of the night. Before we begin, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy slow, gentle journeys through the ancient world. And let me know in the comments, what time is it, and where are you listening from? If you close your eyes for a moment, you can almost hear it, the faint tremor of a river that no longer exists, slipping across land that has long since hardened into desert. The ancient world once called this region the cradle of civilization. But that phrase is almost too confident, too proud. What existed here was softer, more fragile, a balance between mud, water, reed, and memory. Mesopotamia was never a stable stage for human triumph. It was a shoreline that kept shifting, a border between humanity and the unpredictable flow of nature. And like all shorelines, it moved, dissolved, and eventually vanished. Imagine the earliest settlers stepping into the warm shallows of the Euphrates and Tigris delta, feeling the soft, wet earth give beneath their feet, unaware that they were planting the first seeds of cities humanity now barely remembers. Eridu, for example, once whispered as the first city, now lies abandoned under layers of dust, its ancient docks lost to time. The shoreline that once hugged its edges retreated centuries ago, leaving the city stranded, like a forgotten ship left behind by a sea that simply chose not to return. The story repeats itself across the land. Entire rivers wandered away like restless animals. Canals choked, marshes dried, and the water that once fed cities slowly starved them. If you picture Mesopotamia today, its dry wind, its empty plains, it becomes difficult to imagine that this was once a world of shimmering wetlands, home to fishermen, reed house builders, priests who watched stars reflected in black waters, and children who learned to swim before they learned to walk. But that is precisely the truth. The first chapters of human civilization were written on the edges of lakes and marshes that no longer exist. Those ancient shorelines shaped more than cities. They shaped the way people thought. The earliest myths rose from this world of unstable water, flood stories, creation stories, stories of gods lifting the world out of chaos. They weren't abstractions, they were reflections of the land itself. When the rivers overflowed and wiped out entire settlements, the people believed the gods were rewriting the earth. When drought arrived, they believed the gods had turned their faces away. Every shift in water level carried meaning, carried fear, carried hope. It's almost haunting to imagine how familiar the relationship between water and faith must have been. Night after night, families sat on reed mats along the shoreline, telling stories under skies that looked almost identical to ours. Stars spread like sand across darkness. The same constellations we know today watched them rise, plant, harvest, rebuild, and eventually vanish. Civilization moved forward, rivers changed course, and the places where they once told those stories have been erased, swallowed by shifting earth. If you were to walk across the region now, you might pass shattered pottery half buried in sand, the remains of canals that cut through nothing, the outlines of temples that once stood at the water's edge. You might not even recognize that you're walking across an ancient shoreline, but the ground would remember. The earth still carries the ghosts of water. Salt crystals shimmer in the sun where marshes once breathed. The wind shifts slightly, as if searching for the old rivers. And in that quiet, you begin to understand what time truly does. It doesn't only erase, it reshapes. In a way, Mesopotamia never disappeared. Its vanished shores live through the stories written on clay tablets, the myths carried forward by cultures across the ages, and the unbroken thread that connects their world to ours. When we study this land, we aren't just uncovering ruins, we're listening to echoes, and the echoes still carry the soft rhythm of water against a forgotten shore. And so, as we move gently onward, let's follow that echo into the next chapter of this journey, where we'll step deeper into the world that grew around these lost waters. Let's follow the ruins inward, toward the cities that rose from mud brick and starlight. They stood at the heart of the ancient world, like fixed stars in a sky of shifting desert winds, the rulers and priests of Mesopotamia, shaping the destinies of cities that glimmered along the Tigris and Euphrates like strings of faint lanterns. To understand the rhythm of life in this land, you must drift slowly into their world, into the world of men and women who believed themselves chosen, or who convinced others that they were, walking the thin threshold between mortal responsibility and divine expectation. Their lives were not merely lived, they were performed, carved into clay, echoed in temple hymns, and woven into myths that refused to fade even after their bones disappeared into the dust. And so, as we move deeper into Mesopotamia's forgotten centuries, let us step quietly into their chambers of power, as if entering a dim corridor where incense still lingers in the air, and the sound of distant chants rises like warm breath from the earth. Imagine beginning in a palace courtyard before sunrise, when the sky is still a soft slate blue, and only the faintest glow touches the edges of the mud brick walls. The king is already awake, not by leisure, but by necessity, for a Mesopotamian ruler did not simply govern, he anchored the cosmos. Everything depended on his ability to remain in harmony with the gods. If the rivers flooded too deeply, if the crops failed, if enemies advanced from the western deserts, it was never perceived as bad luck or natural misfortune. It was a sign that something within the king's relationship to the heavens had faltered. His very body carried the burden of cosmic balance, and the weight of that responsibility was immense. Even his meals were symbolically aligned with ritual timing. Even his gestures were watched, and even his silences were interpreted through omens. You can almost feel the heaviness of it pressing on the early morning air as he steps across the courtyard in ceremonial robes, the hem brushing quietly against the ground. Now drift into the temple, the ziggurat rising above the city like a stepped mountain crafted by human devotion. Climb, slowly, the long ramp that spirals upward, each step echoing with the memory of centuries of priests who climbed the same path. At the top rests a sanctuary, reserved not for crowds, but for the divine presence believed to dwell within. The priests here were more than caretakers, they were intermediaries, translators of celestial will into earthly instruction. Their days flowed with ritual precision, from reading omens in the movements of birds to interpreting the patterns formed by oil poured into water. Even their sleep was watched carefully, for dreams were considered messages sent from the gods.
The boundary between the human mind and the divine realm was thin, translucent, and easily crossed in the still hours of night. These priests were in many ways the unseen architects of Mesopotamian history. Kings ruled with strength, but priests ruled with interpretation. If a priest read an omen that warned of trouble, the king shifted course. If a tablet revealed a prophecy of victory, armies marched with renewed certainty. It was in the temple records, long shelves of clay tablets arranged in careful rows, that the logic of governance truly lived. Entire libraries dedicated to divination, astronomy, medicine, and ritual told the story of a civilization always looking upward, trying to decipher the vastness of the sky. And as you imagine these tablets, thousands, stacked like frozen words in an eternal whisper, you can almost hear the soft scratch of a reed stylus etching each line, a quiet sound, yet one that shaped empires. Continued drifting now into the private quarters of the royal family, where life was equally constrained by ritual. A queen of Mesopotamia was not merely a spouse, she was a symbolic embodiment of fertility, prosperity, and divine favor. Her presence held both political and spiritual weight, and the palace women around her formed a network of influence that often stretched far beyond the palace walls. Their conversations, carried through courtyards and behind carved wooden screens, could sway alliances, shape marriages between noble houses, or reinforce the authority of the king himself. Their lives were quieter, more hidden, but no less powerful in their impact. Even the lullabies they whispered to their children, gentle songs about protection, providence, and the watchful gaze of the gods, became echoes of the values that shaped future rulers. Now move deeper still, into the rooms where scribes worked by lamplight. These men were the lifeblood of Mesopotamian bureaucracy, trained from childhood to master the complex, wedge-shaped system of cuneiform. Every treaty, every tax record, every law, every hymn, every astronomical chart, each was placed in their hands. To be a scribe was to hold the threads of civilization. You can imagine one sitting cross-legged on a mat, a small lamp casting a faint amber glow over his clay tablet as he presses the stylus into the soft surface. The room around him is lined with tablets, each carrying a moment of human thought turned into something tangible and permanent. In their records we find not only the grand declarations of kings, but also letters from worried farmers, inventories of grain, school exercises from apprentices, and even simple notes, little reminders of the everyday world that existed beneath the grandeur of temples and palaces. But to remain here would be to ignore the other side of power, its fragility. For beneath the ritual, beneath the chants and the royal robes, Mesopotamian rulers lived with the constant fear that their authority could crumble as quickly as a mud brick wall in a sudden rain. Enemies lurked on all horizons: desert raiders from the west, mountain tribes from the north, rival city-states looking for an opportunity to expand. Warfare was frequent, and kings were expected to lead from the front, wielding both sword and symbolism. A defeated king risked not only losing his throne, but also his divine legitimacy. The people believed that the gods abandoned rulers who failed in battle, and once that belief took root, political collapse often followed swiftly. It is here, in this space of tension between divine expectation and human limitation, that the story of Mesopotamian leadership becomes most human, filled with determination, anxiety, ambition, and vulnerability. And yet, even through cycles of conflict, the belief in sacred kingship endured. Festivals reinforced the cosmic order, rituals reenacted the creation of the world, And every year during the Akitu festival, the king symbolically died and was reborn, demonstrating the renewal of universal balance. You can picture the crowds gathering along the streets, incense drifting upward, hymns rising in waves as the king processed with the priests. For a people surrounded by uncertainty, floods, droughts, famine, war, this ritual rhythm created a sense of continuity. It told them the world may change, but its sacred center remains intact. And as the night settles over the city, the palace quiets, the last lamps dim, and the soft sounds of the river drift in through open windows, a Mesopotamian king or priest might lie awake, listening to the silence, aware that every decision they made would echo across centuries. Their world was of immense responsibility, but also profound introspection. They lived at the intersection of heaven and earth, trying to hold the two together with nothing but ritual precision and human determination. And even now, thousands of years later, the shadow of their roles lingers in the ruins of palaces and temples scattered across the desert, silent but not forgotten. And so, as the echoes of their lives fade gently into the dark, let us drift onward to the next layer of Mesopotamia, where mystery, archaeology, and forgotten truths wait beneath the sand. There are secrets buried under collapsed ziggurats, stories hidden in cracked clay tablets, and traces of lives that were never meant to vanish. If you're ready, we'll follow those echoes downward, into the dust, into the fragments, into the questions that still whisper across the ancient world. Let's step gently into that quiet now.
There is a certain kind of silence that exists only in ancient ruins. A silence shaped not by emptiness, but by the weight of everything that once filled the space. As we drift deeper into Mesopotamia's forgotten layers, you may feel that silence settling around you like a warm, slow mist. It softens the world, dims the edges of thought, and invites you to imagine the long sleep of cities buried beneath sand, silt, and time. When archaeologists first pressed their hands into this soil, they were not merely excavating stones and broken pottery. They were disturbing a dream that had lasted for thousands of years. Every brick they uncovered, every tablet they brushed clean, every doorway revealed after centuries of darkness whispered a story that had been waiting patiently, not to shock the world, but simply to breathe again. Imagine standing at the edge of ancient Nippur, one of the most sacred sites in Mesopotamia. The desert stretches out in soft undulations, the wind moving gently over the ground like a hand smoothing wrinkled fabric. Beneath your feet lies a labyrinth of temples, libraries, and dwellings, an entire sacred district lost for centuries before turning into a quiet mound of earth. When excavators first arrived here in the 19th century, they faced not a city, but a vast hill of dust, its true shape hidden beneath layers of erosion. Yet as they dug deeper, the great Acor temple emerged, its walls once dedicated to Enlil, the storm god whose voice was believed to be the wind itself. You can almost sense the reverence that once filled this place, the tread of priests in long robes, the distant hum of ceremonial chants echoing off painted walls. Now everything lies still, the only sound the soft brushing of sand against ancient stone. Far to the south, beneath the scorching sun, the ruins of Ur hold their own secrets. Here the great ziggurat rises in eroded tiers, a monumental stairway stretching toward a sky that has watched civilizations rise and fall without blinking. Archaeologists working among these remains often speak of a strange sensation, as if the past clings to the air. Beneath the ziggurat, they uncovered royal tombs filled with treasures that gleamed even after millennia. Delicate gold headdresses, silver lyres, lapis lazuli beads, and intricate jewelry crafted with astonishing precision. But the most haunting discovery was not the gold. It was the traces of human sacrifice, attendants buried with their rulers in a final, silent procession into the afterlife. These scenes, reconstructed through careful study, reveal a world where death was not an ending, but a continuation, a journey that required companionship even in the shadows. And as you picture those motionless forms arranged in ceremonial order, you can almost hear the faint echo of lyre strings vibrating softly in a world that no longer exists. Archaeology in Mesopotamia is not only about what was found, but about what was lost before it could be understood. Entire libraries once stood here, filled with thousands of clay tablets, many of which crumbled into dust long before scholars could decipher them. Floods swept away countless archives. Fires reduced entire collections to powder. Even the great library of Ashurbanipal, the closest thing the ancient world had to a universal archive, survives only in fragments. But the tablets that remain tell stories of astonishing depth, epic myths of gods and heroes, lists of kings stretching back into mythic time, medical treatises prescribing remedies with a mixture of herbs and incantations, and astronomical observations that charted the paths of stars with careful precision. When modern scholars read these tablets, they are not only deciphering words, they are resurrecting minds, thoughts, and fears that lived thousands of years before us. Consider the city of Mary, where a discovery in the 1930s revealed something extraordinary. A palace with nearly 300 rooms, its walls once covered in vivid frescoes. The colors, though faded, still speak with surprising clarity. You can imagine stepping into those rooms. The floor is cool beneath your feet. The painted scenes of rituals and processions unfolding across the walls like frozen stories. One painting shows a goddess offering life to a king, a moment of divine approval captured in pigment that survived long after the kingdom itself fell into ruin. Nearby, archaeologists uncovered thousands of diplomatic letters detailing negotiations, alliances, betrayals, and political tension across the Near East. These letters are some of the most human artifacts in Mesopotamia. Brief, direct, and full of emotion. A king complains about receiving too little gold. A governor warns of an approaching enemy. A queen expresses concern for her family. They are the voices of people who lived with the same anxieties and hopes that echo through modern life, yet whose world was shaped by forces both mystical and monumental. But archaeology also reveals a quieter side of Mesopotamian life. In the remains of ordinary homes, tiny clay toys have been found. Little animals, miniature carts, small figurines. These humble objects hint at childhood laughter, at parents watching their children play in dusty courtyards, at moments of joy that rarely found their way into official records. In workshop ruins, molds for bronze tools still lie scattered. traces of the daily labor that kept cities functioning. In abandoned kitchens, archaeologists found grinding stones worn smooth by generations of hands. These small details bring the ancient world into focus, not as a distant civilization of mythic grandeur, but as a place filled with ordinary people who woke, worked, loved, feared, and dreamed, just as we do. Some of the most mysterious discoveries come from beneath collapsed buildings, where sealed rooms preserved items untouched for centuries. At Uruk, a temple storeroom yielded hundreds of clay tablets documenting grain distribution, suggesting a complex economic system far ahead of its time. In other rooms, clay jar stoppers remained sealed, their contents long evaporated, but their purpose unmistakable. These untouched spaces are like time capsules, offering rare glimpses into untouched moments frozen beneath the sands. Yet, for all that has been uncovered, far more remains hidden. Vast stretches of Mesopotamia remain unexcavated, their secrets buried beneath modern cities, farmland, or shifting political borders. Satellite imagery reveals the faint outlines of ancient canals, roads, and city walls stretching across the landscape like faded scars. Each of these marks hints at a world still sleeping, waiting for gentle hands to brush away the earth. Archaeologists often describe Mesopotamia as an unfinished story, one that continues to unfold each time a new mound is surveyed, each time a forgotten tablet is deciphered. In this quiet space between discovery and loss, between what we know and what lies beyond our reach, we find the true mystery of Mesopotamia. It is not in the dramatic ruins or the spectacular artifacts, but in the vastness of what remains hidden. The ancient scribes themselves understood this. Many tablets end with warnings. Do not alter the words. Do not erase them. Do not let them be lost. They feared that knowledge could vanish if not carefully preserved. And for thousands of years, they were right. Sandstorms, conquest, fire, and neglect erased stories that would have enriched our understanding of humanity. Still, the fragments that survive whisper enough. They remind us that beneath the broken bricks and shattered pottery lies a world of poets, astronomers, rulers, priests, merchants, farmers, and children, a world that shaped the foundations of civilization, yet left behind more questions than answers. These ruins invite us not to solve every mystery, but to sit quietly with the uncertainty, to feel the presence of lives that flickered briefly before fading into the desert wind. And so, as we let the dust settle again over ancient walls and the echoes of lost voices fade softly into the night, we drift toward another layer of Mesopotamia, one shaped by the elites who lived high above the common world, in palaces where luxury, ceremony, and privilege formed a world of their own. Their lives cast long shadows across history, and in those shadows we find stories of grandeur, ambition, and the quiet fragility of power. If you are ready, we will step upward now into the world of nobles and royal households, where the air was heavier with incense, and the walls listened to conversations that shaped empires. Let us walk there gently. Power in ancient Mesopotamia was never a single flame burning at the top of a ziggurat. It was a network, soft, layered, and woven through countless hands that shaped the rhythms of daily life far more quietly than kings ever could. If you were standing inside a palace in Babylon or Ur, the first thing you would feel is not grandeur, but order. Servants crossing smooth floors with steady steps, scribes moving carefully with bundles of clay tablets pressed to their chests, officials slipping into shadowed corridors where only certain eyes were allowed to see. Everything moved as though guided by an invisible pattern that had existed long before any ruler claimed the throne. The king was the center of this world, but even he was not absolute. Each morning, the palace stirred with a controlled tension, messengers arriving from distant towns, merchants petitioning for approval on trade shipments, priests bearing omens interpreted from the sky or from the strange language of animals. Every decision passed through layers of influence, noble families who managed estates older than the city walls, scribes who carved policies into clay, and officials whose voices shaped the tone of entire reigns. The city might have looked toward the king for leadership, but the quiet machinery behind him was what kept the world turning. Scribes were among the most powerful people in the palace, though they rarely appeared in inscriptions celebrating victory or ritual. Their authority lay in their hands, the ability to write, record, and preserve. A single line on a tablet could change the ownership of land, alter a tax, or approve a caravan that would travel hundreds of miles. In a world where memory was baked into clay and preserved for centuries, these quiet figures controlled the future in a way that swords never could. Their rooms, filled with the faint, dusty scent of drying tablets, were the true heart of government. Yet higher still, beyond the reach of royal officials and noble households, the priesthood held a power that even kings approached with caution. The gods were believed to speak constantly, through storms, eclipses, patterns of stars, illnesses, and even the shape of a sheep's liver during sacrifice. Priests became translators of the divine, interpreting messages that determined when armies marched, when canals were repaired, or when the king needed to perform a ritual of purification. Within temple walls, the air was thick with incense, soft chanting, and the sound of ritual water dripping into stone basins. These spaces were not merely religious centers, they were engines of political influence, cosmic anchors that held the city in balance. The temples also served as economic powerhouses, managing large estates, employing workers, and controlling the distribution of grain and offerings. To neglect the temple was to risk both divine anger and social collapse. For this reason, rulers relied heavily on priests, and priests, in turn, guided rulers with a gentle but firm hand. Their knowledge of astronomy, agriculture, and ritual gave them a stable authority that survived even when dynasties fell. But not all influence was official. In the quiet chambers of the inner palace, royal women shaped diplomacy with a precision rarely seen on the battlefield. Letters written by queens and princesses reveal negotiations, requests, and warnings hidden beneath graceful language. They arranged marriages between cities, secured alliances, managed internal disputes, and shaped the upbringing of heirs. Their presence was subtle, but the echo of their decisions can still be felt in the tablets they left behind. All of these layers, kings, nobles, scribes, priests, and palace women, created a world where power moved like a slow river, branching, merging, and reshaping itself without ever losing its direction.
It made Mesopotamian society remarkably resilient. A palace might be burned in war, a king might vanish in battle, a dynasty might collapse, but the deeper structures remained intact. The scribes continued their records, the priests continued their rituals, the noble families continued their influence. Life adapted, reorganized, and carried forward the same rhythms that had guided the city for centuries. Walking through the ruins today, you can feel this complexity in the architecture itself. Corridors twist like branching paths of authority. Rooms open into each other in patterns that reflect the careful separation of officials, rituals, and the private life of the court. Even in silence, the stones seem to remember the footsteps that once determined the shape of empires. And as this world softens and dissolves into dusk, we follow its fading edges toward the forces that guided it. Beliefs, rituals, and the invisible threads connecting human action to the will of the gods. As we leave the winding corridors of the palace behind, the world of Mesopotamia begins to open into a quieter, deeper landscape, one shaped not by the decisions of kings or the calculations of scribes, but by forces the people believed lay far beyond human reach. To understand how this civilization truly lived, you must follow their gaze upward, toward the sky that stretched endlessly above the plains, and downward, toward the earth that held both nourishment and mystery. For in Mesopotamia, every choice, from planting a field to founding a city, moved in rhythm with rituals, omens, and signs that tied human life to the vast, unpredictable will of the gods. Imagine the twilight settling across the rooftops of Babylon, the last traces of sunlight fading from the ziggurats' uppermost terrace. This was the hour when priests stepped into the stillness, lifting their eyes toward the stars. Each constellation carried a meaning, each path across the heavens a message. A subtle shift in a planet's movement might warn of famine. A gentle brightening of a star might promise prosperity. Night after night, these observations were etched into clay tablets, turning the sky into an enormous text that only the most carefully trained could read. And from these readings, kings received guidance: when to begin a canal, when to hold back soldiers, when to offer gifts to the gods to soften some unseen danger drifting toward the city. Even the simplest of actions, slaughtering an animal for a meal, lighting a lamp, or crossing a threshold, could contain signs, subtle and often unnoticed except by the watchful. A priest examining the liver of a sacrificed sheep might trace faint lines across its surface, interpreting its ridges and shapes like a map of divine intention. These predictions did not merely influence life, they directed it. A ruler could not begin a campaign without favorable omens. Farmers would not plant without the right signs from the earth. Traders consulted priests before embarking on long journeys, believing that a single unnoticed warning could lead to misfortune far from home. Yet these rituals were not rooted in fear alone. They were expressions of a relationship the Mesopotamians believed they shared with the divine. In their eyes, the gods were not distant beings, but active participants in the life of the city. Statues of deities, kept deep within temple sanctuaries, were treated almost like living members of the community. Each dawn, priests washed the statues, dressed them in fine garments, and placed food before them. These offerings sustained not the gods,
but the order of the cosmos itself. To neglect them was to risk the balance that kept the rivers flowing predictably and the seasons turning in harmony. Within these temples, life moved with deliberate serenity. The air smelled of oils and incense, soft chanting echoed from stone walls, and the sound of footsteps was muffled by layers of woven mats. It was here that the city's spiritual rhythm was maintained. Festivals marked the passage of months, carrying crowds through processions that wound from the palace to the temple gates. Some festivals reenacted myths of creation, reminding the people of the fragile line between chaos and order. Others called upon the gods to bless the harvest or protect the city from drought. In these moments, even the most powerful figures, kings, governors, wealthy merchants, became part of a larger pattern, bound by rituals older than their own names. But belief in divine signs also shaped the quieter corners of life. In small houses made of mud brick, families honored protective spirits with household altars. Amulets were placed under beds to guard against sickness. Clay figurines were buried at thresholds or placed near cradles to keep harmful forces away. Illness was not simply a physical event, it was a message, a disturbance in the fragile harmony between human life and cosmic intention. Healers combined herbal knowledge with incantations whispered in the soft glow of lamplight, restoring not only the body, but the spiritual balance surrounding it. In this world, the visible and invisible were never truly separate. Every flood, every storm, every unexpected event shimmered with meaning. To live in Mesopotamia was to exist in a constant dialogue with forces larger than oneself, to read the world like a vast text written by divine hands. And perhaps this is why the civilization endured for so long, not only through strength or knowledge, but through its deep awareness of the unseen, its understanding that human life must move in harmony with the rhythms of the universe. As this layer of Mesopotamian life settles into stillness around you, let us drift onward, gently, toward the final pieces of this ancient world, their legacy, their disappearance, and the silent echoes they left behind. As we move toward the final stretch of this ancient landscape, the world of Mesopotamia begins to soften around the edges, like a memory slowly returning to the quiet place where all forgotten civilizations rest. The bustling courts fade, the temple chants dissolve into the air. The tablets, once freshly impressed with the sharp lines of cuneiform signs, settle back into the silence of baked clay. And in this fading light, what remains is not the noise of the cities, nor the laws of their kings, but the gentle pulse of a legacy that shaped the course of human history long after its last kingdoms fell. Imagine standing on the plains at dusk, where the horizon stretches endlessly, and the ruins of ancient cities lie scattered like broken constellations on the earth. Somewhere beneath your feet are the remains of palaces where kings planned their futures, storerooms that once overflowed with grain, and scribal schools where young students learned to press reeds into wet clay. You can almost feel the weight of time pressing upward from the soil, carrying fragments of stories that once defined entire worlds. Yet, from up here, all of it feels quiet, as though the land itself has taken a long breath after thousands of years of movement. The rivers that nurtured these civilizations, the Tigris and the Euphrates, still carve their way through the landscape, but their courses are not the same, and the cities that once sat proudly along their banks are now distant from the water that gave them life. Floods shifted the riverbeds, silt buried foundations,
and the relentless turning of seasons slowly reclaimed what was once the center of the world. For all their achievements, the great cities of Mesopotamia were always vulnerable to the forces of nature they believed the gods controlled. Droughts weakened them, storms damaged their walls, and the slow change of climate nudged the fields toward exhaustion. And yet, even as these pressures built, it was never a single catastrophe that ended them. It was a quiet unraveling. Trade routes shifted, new powers rose. A city prospered one century and faded the next. Bit by bit, the world changed its shape, and Mesopotamia, once the beating heart of civilization, found itself pulled into the shadows of empires that learned from it, borrowed from it, and carried its ideas far beyond the place where they were first imagined. Assyria and Babylon gave way to Persia. Persia gave way to Greece. Greece gave way to Rome. Each power absorbed pieces of the old Mesopotamian world, its astronomy, its mathematics, its stories, its laws, even the rhythms of its administration. And through these quiet inheritances, Mesopotamia never truly disappeared. Its shadow stretches across time, reaching into the foundations of writing, cities, governance, and science. Every document written today echoes the first clay tablets. Every city with districts and officials echoes the structure of the earliest urban centers. Every legal system carries distant reflections of Hammurabi's codes. Even the constellations traced by modern astronomers carry the ancient names first recorded under the clear skies of Babylon. It's a strange kind of permanence, one that exists not in stone or monuments, but in ideas that slipped quietly into the collective memory of humanity. The cities themselves crumbled, but their way of thinking continued to move forward, carried by travelers, conquerors, scholars, and stories passed from one culture to the next. The people who once walked the streets of Ur or Mari could never have imagined how far their influence would spread or how long their echoes would remain. And so as the night settles gently over these imagined ruins, it becomes clear that Mesopotamia's truest legacy is not its buildings or its rulers, but its ability to shape the world through the enduring tools it left behind: writing that captured human thought, rituals that tied communities together, governance that organized complex societies, and stories that linked the heavens to the earth. In this final quiet moment, the dust begins to settle once more. The stars rise above the plains just as they did thousands of years ago, shining with the same patterns the ancient priests once studied from the tops of their temples. And you can feel the weight of their world softly folding into the night, not lost, not forgotten, but absorbed into the long, continuous story of humanity. Take a breath and let the silence of this old civilization drift across you like a warm wind from a distant age. And when you're ready, you can close this journey, knowing that you've walked through the heart of a world that shaped the foundations of everything that came after it, quietly, patiently, and with a depth that still lingers in the spaces between our own lives today.
And as the last echoes of this ancient world settle into the quiet spaces around you, let the weight of Mesopotamia rest gently in your thoughts, like the slow settling of dust across forgotten stones. We have walked through cities that no longer stand, traced the paths of rivers that have long since shifted, and listened to the soft voices of people whose names have dissolved into time. Yet their world, fragile and magnificent, still lingers in the small details of our own, whispers carried forward through stories, through language, and through the quiet endurance of memory. For now, allow the plains to fade from view.
Let the ziggurats sink back into shadow, their stairways dissolving into the night sky. Let the murmurs of ancient temples drift into silence, and let your own breathing fall into that slow, steady rhythm that has accompanied humanity since the first fires were lit beside the Euphrates. There is nothing left to search for, nothing left to uncover, only rest and the soft reassurance that these worlds remain with us, not through their ruins, but through the calm understanding we carry after visiting them. If your eyes feel heavy, allow them to close. If your thoughts wander, let them drift freely, like lanterns floating above a quiet river. And if sleep begins to reach for you, don't resist it. These stories were meant to guide you gently into that still and peaceful place where time no longer matters. Thank you for traveling through this ancient landscape with me tonight. And wherever you are, whether listening from a quiet room, a distant city, or somewhere between waking and dreaming, I hope the journey brings you rest, comfort, and a deeper connection to the long, silent history beneath our feet. Until the next story, good night.